many of us, myself included, would love to know whether we're alone in the universe or whether there might be life all over the place. And the more I know about the Earth, the more I start thinking that Earth might not be unusual in having an origin of life. That may happen many places in the universe. But what might make Earth unusual is the fact that life has persisted for 4 billion years.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Elliot Rana, and on behalf of Harvard Bookstore, Long Now Boston, the Harvard Library, and the Harvard Division of Science, I am so thrilled to introduce tonight's speakers. Andrew H. Knoll is the Fisher Research Professor of Natural History and Earth and Planetary Sciences, Emeritus, here at Harvard University. The recipient of the International Prize for Biology and the Crawford Prize in Geosciences, he is a member of the National Academy of Sciences. He'll be joined tonight by Robin Wordsworth, Gordon McKay Professor of Harvard's Earth and Planetary Sciences Department. Tonight, they're here to discuss Earth and Life, a 4 billion year conversation. In this captivating book, Knoll traces how all life is sustained by Earth's geological and atmospheric dynamics, and how life itself shapes the physical environment. Taking readers on a thrilling journey across 4 billion years of Earth history, he shows how Earth and life interact to cycle the very elements of life from rocks, water, and air, and how these and related processes control our climate, regulate our atmosphere, and support the diversification of life forms, great and small. Along the way, Knoll explains how we can draw on this history as we navigate the challenges of the Anthropocene and how it can aid our search for life elsewhere in the universe. Sean B. Carroll calls Earth and Life, quote, a tour de force, weaving together the two greatest stories on Earth, the evolution of life and the planet itself. Andrew Knoll reveals the dynamic dialogue that created our world. There's grandeur in this new and hard-earned view. You will never look at our planet or others in the same way. We're so pleased to be here at the Harvard Geological Museum tonight. Please join me in welcoming Andrew H. Knoll.
Thank you, and thank you all for coming out this evening. I will just add one thing to my resume that you heard that you might not know, and that was I was actually born in the same hospital as Taylor Swift. So she doesn't talk about it much, but it's true. This book has just come out, and it's basically my attempt to explain to a broad audience how the planet works. And the through-running idea is that almost everything you experience in the world around you, from the composition of the atmosphere and oceans to really the courses of rivers as they went through valleys, reflects the interactions of geological and biological processes. There's certainly history in the book, but mainly it's a discussion of how everything around us came to be, how it's maintained, and because of that, it provides something of a background to think about what is happening to the planet in the times of not only ourselves, but maybe more importantly, our children and grandchildren. So let me just give you one quick slide to give you just a broad flavor, and then I'm going to spend the rest of my time talking about one particular problem that I think really epitomizes this relationship and conversation between the planet and the biology it sustains. Turns out the idea that Earth and life are inextricably intertwined isn't new. Alexander von Humboldt said it in 1799. He basically said that everything is interrelated, that you can't understand the organisms on a mountainside without understanding the mountain, without understanding the atmosphere and climate and all of that. And he was just right. Now, that idea was really lost as professional science came into flower in the 1800s, and basically all the different types of science built silos around themselves, and there was very little interaction between people from different disciplines, something that is fortunately changing a great deal now. Now, I'm going to talk a little bit about carbon just because in your cells, 40% of the dry weight of your cells is carbon. And the interesting thing about that carbon is that the carbon atoms in you right now were in the atmosphere or dissolved in the ocean not long ago. And they came to you through your food. If you are eating plants, the plants had actually removed that CO2 from the atmosphere, and then you take it in as organic matter. If you're eating animals, it's either animals that ate the plants or animals that ate the animals that ate the plants. And the carbon cycle itself has both geological and biological components. So here's just one little cartoon, and you can see that a lot of carbon is removed from the atmosphere every year. That's land photosynthesis, marine photosynthesis, which is more or less of the same order of magnitude. They remove an amount of CO2 equivalent to maybe about a third of all the CO2 that's in the atmosphere. Now, all of you have been around for more than 4 or 5 years, so you know that something else must be going on. And the main thing that's going on is something that you're all contributing to right now. You are respiring, which means you eat organic matter, molecules as food, and then your body reacts those with oxygen to gain energy. And the CO2 then goes back to the atmosphere and is available again for primary production. But if you look at the numbers, the amount of respiration doesn't quite match the amount of photosynthesis. And it turns out that, something on the order of 1% of all the organic matter made by photosynthetic organisms every year doesn't get respired, but ends up being deposited in sediments on land and in the oceans. So there must be other processes. One of the important ones is rock weathering. That is the chemical reactions that sort of eat away at mountainsides and deliver their materials down to the sea. Weathering happens because the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere reacts with water to produce a weak acid. And that weak acid then sort of etches into mountainsides. The carbon eventually ends up as limestone in the oceans. That's a very important process, very important in regulating climate, among other things, but it makes the problem of atmospheric CO2 worse because it's another way of pulling CO2 out of the atmosphere. So what else might be going on? Well, it turns out that carbon that's buried in sediment, some of it will be lifted up into mountainsides and itself get weathered, and oxygen will then return that organic carbon to CO2. Some of it, because of a process called plate tectonics, will actually be subsumed down into Earth's mantle again and will come out as CO2 in volcanoes. So volcanoes then are the great equalizer. And for a long time, the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere has been reasonably constant, at least thousands of years, and that all represents this very, very intricate interplay between what life is doing and what the physical planet is doing. Now, I could tell the same story about the phosphorus in your body. You have phosphorus in things like your DNA and in the membranes in your cells. Also, your bones are actually mineralized with phosphorus minerals. There's no phosphorus in the atmosphere, so there has to be another way of getting it. And again, it's rock weathering that essentially dissolves phosphate ions out of rocks. They go into soils and water. And again, plants and algae, the primary producers, can take those up, and then the phosphorus travels through a biological cycle. You could tell the same story about nitrogen and other minerals. But this is just to give you some sense for the fact that so many processes that we may take for granted actually involve this intricate conversation between Earth and life. Well, with that, let me talk about one example for the rest of my time, and that is the story of oxygen. Now, you don't need me to explain that not only does the atmosphere contain about 21% oxygen gas, we need it. And two interesting observations serve to set up the problem. The first is that life on Earth could not have begun on an oxygen-rich planet. I mean, years ago, when I was working on a Mars mission, something like the MER mission to Mars in the early 2000s, some of the things that we were finding on Mars were intriguing. And so I wrote one night to a bunch of friends who do origin of life research. I said, what happens to your experiments if you add oxygen? And every one of them wrote back and said, oh, we'd never do that because that kills the experiment. And so Earth life began on an oxygen-poor planet. And yet, everyone in this room, many, many other species require oxygen in substantial quantities to live. And if that's the case, then the Earth must have changed markedly, substantially through time. So that raises an interesting question. How can we make estimates of how much oxygen was in the atmosphere in the deep past? It turns out there are some samples of, if you will, fossil air. When glacial ice forms in Antarctica and Greenland, it will commonly incorporate air bubbles, and those can be preserved through time. And we now have samples of ancient air, if you will, but they only go back about 6 million years. That still leaves, more than 4 billion years unaccounted for. So we need proxies. We need things that geologists and geochemists can actually measure in ancient rocks that give us some sense of how much oxygen has existed through time to get at this great problem of going from a planet without oxygen to a planet with lots of oxygen. And a great place to study that is the Black Sea, because as some of you might know, the Black Sea has lots of oxygen in the top 100 meters or so of the sea, but beneath that, there's no oxygen at all. So if you go in and look for things in the chemistry of sediments that are depositing beneath these shallow and deep waters, you'll get some sense of what differs when oxygen is present or absent. And this is just one little example here. There's a lot of iron in the minerals that sandstones and shales accumulate on the seafloor. A lot of that iron is in minerals that come from granites and other rocks that are weathered and eroded, but some which are sometimes called highly reactive iron, that's iron oxides, iron carbonate, iron sulfides, actually form in the water column or in the shallow sediments, and they increase the iron content of the rocks. Also, if you look at that highly reactive iron, you can measure how much of that highly reactive iron consists of pyrite or fool's gold. It's called degree of pyritization. And so if you look in this little graph on the lower right, it turns out that samples from the shallow Black Sea would fall in this quadrant. Not much highly reactive iron, not much pyrite. Samples from the deep Black Sea fall up in here. Now, the interesting thing about this graph is it's actually not a graph of the Black Sea. This is from a sedimentary basin in Australia that's at about 1.5 billion years old. And yet it gives you the same kind of signature that you get today in the Black Sea. And there are now many, many thousands of these type of iron measurements have been made, and they all tell a similar story. So that's helpful. So when did we first start seeing evidence that there was oxygen accumulating in the atmosphere and surface oceans? And the answer turns out to be about 2 billion years into the history of the planet. Earth was an oxygen-poor planet for 2 billion years, and the geologic record, based on all of these different proxies, tells us that it was about 2.4 to 2.2 billion years ago when oxygen started to accumulate, oxygen gas. And the fact that it says 2.4 to 2.2 doesn't mean that we're uncertain of when it happened. It turns out it's a protracted process that happens over a long period of time. The first evidence to really suggest in a reasonably rigorous way that the early Earth was oxygen poor came from sedimentary rocks like these beautiful red things that are exposed in Western Australia. These rocks are called banded iron formation. They are rocks that, as the name implies, are just layer after layer of chert or SiO2, quartz-rich layers, and layers that are rich in iron minerals. Those kind of rocks are abundant in rock sequences that are older than 2.4 billion years and much rarer thereafter. And that's something interesting to think about. And it turns out that people finally came to realize that rocks like iron formation cannot form in the modern ocean because they require that you can move iron through the oceans in solution. And that won't happen if oxygen is present. The oxygen will basically react with the iron and form rust, and it just comes out of solution. So these rocks, which are, of course, the source of most of the industrial iron that people have used for the last 1,000 years or more, comes from rocks deposited in the first 2 billion years of Earth history. And there are other lines of evidence that people have looked at. So for example, in the lower right, this is a slide through a sandstone. And what you see is that there's a sand grain, which is kind of golden colored. And that's because that gold is fool's gold. It's iron pyrite. Now, if I put a sample of iron pyrite out on this desk and came back in 30 years, it would have been destroyed and you'd see gypsum in its place. This particular specimen, which is in a 2.7 billion year old sandstone, was uplifted and exposed in a mountainside. It was eroded, traveled through a river, and deposited in the shallow sea without ever coming in contact with oxygen. There are other minerals, minerals of uraninite and that are uranium that have similar features. And all of these have the same time distribution. They're common before 2.4 billion years ago and basically absent thereafter. So different lines of evidence are sort of confirming this idea that the first half of Earth's history was oxygen poor. Now, all those things are fairly qualitative, but there's one other line of evidence, and stay with me now, because this is probably the most demanding thing that I'll say all evening. Sulfur comes in a number of different isotopic flavors. That is, a lot of sulfur, which has 16 protons, 16 neutrons, has also 16 protons, 16 electrons, also has 16 neutrons. That makes it, has an atomic weight of 32, so it's called sulfur 32. Some sulfur, also fairly common, has 2 extra neutrons, so that's sulfur 34. And it turns out sulfur 32, 33, 34, and 35 are all present in various materials found in the Earth. And for a long time, people were interested in these because certain biological processes actually alter the ratio of those things when sulfur is used biologically. Because it turns out that it's the protons and electrons that determine what kind of reaction sulfur undergoes. But the rate of the reaction depends on how many neutrons are there, because some of the sulfur atoms are heavier than others, and the lighter ones are often incorporated preferentially. And it turns out that for a long time, nobody measured sulfur 33 or 36 because there's not much of it, and it was very challenging just to make the measurement. But then a graduate student named James Farquhar, working in the lab of Mark Tiemens at the University of California, San Diego, actually measured all 4 isotopes on a sample of sulfur from a meteorite that originated on Mars. And to everyone's surprise, he found out that unlike on Earth, where if you measure 2 of the isotopes, you can calculate the other isotopes because the kind of processes that fractionate these do it in a way that depends on mass. On Mars, something else was happening. And James and Mark figured that it was chemical reactions with light and other kinds of solar radiation in an atmosphere that had no oxygen. So there's a whole way of dealing with sulfur that was different when there was no oxygen around. And then James did the next interesting thing. He went and looked at samples of sulfur in sedimentary rocks from the early Earth and found they also had this signature. And the only reason I show this little diagram is you can see that the right-hand side of the diagram differs from the left, which means that the right-hand side actually shows evidence of this sort of mass-independent behavior of sulfur isotopes, and it stops at 2.4 billion years ago, which not only, again, corroborates the idea that the Earth is changing, but because of these processes, people have actually estimated quantitatively how much oxygen could have been present in the first 2 billion years of our planet. And it turns out to be no more than about a millionth of what we have today. So the first thing to say, we know when we start on the road to a modern Earth. Now, why would that change? And the answer, in a way, is biological. The only process that we know of that can produce oxygen gas in quantities large enough to transform the atmosphere is photosynthesis. And it turns out there's about 7 different groups of bacteria that can do some type of photosynthesis, but only one of them gets the electrons it needs for the process from water, and only that one produces oxygen gas. And that's cyanobacteria, easily my favorite organisms on Earth. So maybe there's a simple answer to this question of why did the Earth change at 2.4 billion years ago. Maybe it's just because that's when cyanobacteria evolved. And you might say, by the way, oh, but what about the oak tree in my yard or the algae that I see in the sea? They're photosynthetic too. And the answer is yes, they are. And in fact, photosynthesis in the leaves of a tree is done by little organelles called chloroplasts. And we now know, in no small part due to the work of the late Lynn Margulis, that the chloroplast in a maple tree is derived originally from a cyanobacterium that was swallowed by a protozoan 1.5 billion years ago and reduced to metabolic slavery. So these things turn out to be the only organisms that ever evolved the capacity to do this kind of photosynthesis. And one of the nice things is that we actually have a pretty good fossil record of fossil cyanobacteria, going back at least for the last 2.5 billion years or so. And when people have tried to make what are called molecular clocks to estimate the time of origin of cyanobacteria, almost everybody who's done the exercise comes out with the same estimate. The way this works, and I won't go into it in detail, is that we have sequences of DNA for all of these organisms. And if we can calibrate when some of these branching points occurred using fossils, then we can actually estimate the rates at which the DNA is changing through time. And in pretty much every case, it suggests that cyanobacteria first evolved hundreds of millions of years before this great oxygen event. Here's just another one from Greg Fournier, who works just down the street. Again, it's suggesting that the ability to use water in photosynthesis and derive oxygen from it, that probably began 400 or 500 million years before the atmosphere changed. Now that raises a conundrum. Also, when you look at these chemical proxies for oxygen in deep time, we see what are called whiffs of oxygen. I love that term. It turns out that you find evidence that during this earlier time before the global transformation of the planet, there's evidence that there was transient local accumulations of oxygen. Didn't last long, but it's there. So both biology and the geological record suggests we can't just say, oh, you evolved cyanobacteria 2.4 billion years ago. It's easy. In fact, cyanobacteria were there a long time before the transformation, and we really need to ask why the amount of oxygen they produced was insufficient to oxidize the planet. So here's a modern ecological situation that can help us. This is a place I worked some years ago. It's a lovely island, uninhabited, in the Turks and Caicos in the Caribbean. And what you're looking at, the entire interior of this island is covered by microbial communities called microbial mats. And if you cut a section through one of those, you see this very nice alteration of colors. In the top layer, it's blue-green. That's cyanobacteria that build the mats. But it turns out as you go down into the mat, you run out of oxygen, but light continues deeper. So you see that pink layer beneath the green. That's actually photosynthetic bacteria that do not get their electrons from water. They get it from things like hydrogen sulfide, from reduced iron, from hydrogen gas. And basically, if those oxidants are available, it's cheaper metabolically for them to use that. And so even today, where you have light but no oxygen, cyanobacteria don't do very well. So one of the, at least part of the answer, is that on the early Earth, they just didn't compete well against other kinds of photosynthetic bacteria because there was no oxygen. And there was a nice paper just in the corner. There's this Jones et al. 2015. This is from the lab of Don Canfield in Denmark, who's one of the best biogeochemists around. And they suggested that, you know, if there wasn't much phosphate around, which is an essential nutrient, then you'd run out of phosphate before you ran out of things like reduced iron for photosynthesis, and cyanobacteria would never take over. So that then, which I think is a very good idea, and that then says, well, why wouldn't there have been much phosphate on the early Earth? And we go back to the physical Earth. Turns out a lot of people have tried to estimate how much primary production happened in the first billion years of life, and everybody says it's low. The important thing that we did in a paper led by a really wonderful young geochemist in China named Jihua Hao is that it depends on how much photosynthesis you can have will depend on just how much phosphorus is being weathered from continents and going into the oceans. And it turns out, for a variety of reasons, largely having to do with the idea that the Earth's interior was hotter on the early Earth than it is now. It's been losing heat for 4 billion years. That the early Earth was probably like an ocean world. Yeah, there were volcanoes sitting up here, and we have sediments from them, but largely seas covered the Earth. There were not large continents. There were not high mountains. Some of that work was done by Rebecca Fisher over in the next building. And I think if we were going to write this paper again today, we'd have another line, because it's now looking very much like large stable continents started to emerge from the sea about 2.5 billion years ago. That is right before we had this transition. So we think that, again, one of the drivers was to add a lot of phosphate nutrient to seawater, which would then use up all these non-water oxidants or electron donors, and then cyanobacteria take over. And they were what ecologists call ecological engineers, because they would then clean all these other electron donors out of the zone where light can purchase, and the result would be basically a geologically driven increase in the production of oxygen by cyanobacteria that would lead to this new steady state. Now, if you ask how much oxygen accumulated, the answer is not much. For the next nearly 2 billion years, there might have been 1 or a couple % of the amount of oxygen that's in present-day atmosphere and oceans. And again, it relies on a whole bevy of different proxies. And again, they all give a consistent answer. Now, turns out that's not enough for all of us in this room to breathe, but it's enough to have a new type of cell, which is the eukaryotic cell. There's some fossils that are over 1 billion years old. And basically, also molecular clocks for eukaryotes suggest, yeah, after Earth became oxygenated, we start to get this new type of cell, which makes, of course, much of the biology we see around us possible. And the story has more chapters, but I'm going to stop here. It turns out, here's just 3 different papers that I was an et al. On. I'll just point out to this one that when you look at all of the proxies that have been measured over the last 2 decades, you find out, again, there's not much oxygen in the atmosphere and surface oceans until sort of the end of the Precambrian, around 600 million years ago. And then you can see it goes up a little bit. And that's when we first start seeing animals. But it doesn't become like today. We don't have oceans that are oxygenated from top to bottom until about 400 million years ago. So there's more to the story, which I talk about in the book, but won't talk about here. And then just to point out that it's probably not a coincidence that we see early animals just when A, there's evidence for more oxygen, B, there's evidence for a transformation of phosphorus. Almost all of the commercial phosphate deposits that are used to make fertilizer were deposited from 600 million years ago and later. There's just a total transformation. And by the way, that's exactly when we see the first Himalaya scale mountains in more than 1 billion years. So once again, tectonics is driving part of it. Biology is both driving other parts and responding. So I'll stop there. Just one more cartoon to show that the story of O is complicated. And I hope that gives some idea of the fact that you can't just be a geologist and solve this problem. You can't just be a biologist and solve this problem. But if you put earth scientists and biologists together, we can gain, I think, a much better understanding of how our planet works. So I'll stop with that, and then I guess Robin's going to come up and we'll have some discussion.
I'm curious what the kind of initial motivation for the book was. How did you first come up with the idea?
Well, in a way, my fascination of how Earth and life interact goes back to when I was an undergraduate. I have to say that when I was 18, I didn't have the slightest idea of what I should do in life. Not very popular with my father, I should say, but I just really didn't know. I came from a rural background, and so I'd never met a PhD. I did know that you could be a doctor or a lawyer or an engineer, and I knew I didn't want to be a doctor or a lawyer. And I actually was good at math, so I thought, okay, I'll be an engineer. And then being really wise, I realized after my first year in college that engineering and I were not cut out for a long relationship either. And I should say that, I've had the privilege of working with engineers at the Jet Propulsion Lab in Pasadena. And these are wonderful people. I think if I had had the kind of education they did, maybe I would have been an engineer. But when I went back to the university for my second year, just out of almost desperation, I took a whole bunch of science and math courses, audited 1 or 2 others. And it turned out there were 2 that struck me as interesting. One was a course on geology, this idea that, if you know how to look at rocks, you can understand our planet's history from the rocks you see in cliffs and outcroppings. And the other was in biology. And one night, sitting in my room, it dawned on me that maybe these weren't the separate universes as they seemed to be from the way they were taught. Maybe if I was interested in the history of life, I'd do better if I could actually understand the history of the planet. And vice versa, if I wanted to understand the history of the planet, it would probably help to understand what life is doing and what its role is in all of this. And that just changed my life. And ever since then, I've wanted to do research that would try to understand this conversation between Earth and life. Now that's 50 years before the book that we have here. But I think through time, my work has become, they now call this geobiology, and my work has become more and more geobiological. And I just got to the point where I think that all of us would have better lives if we understood a little bit about the planet we live on. And so helping people to understand that is something I wanted to, or aspired to do. And also, I think we want people to vote wisely because the Earth is changing. And I think the more you understand about how our planet works, the more wisdom you will bring to basically the votes that are going to determine what the environment for your children and grandchildren will be. So it's really just the hope of helping people to understand where we live.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's striking. You note at the start of the book how geobiology as a field didn't really exist when you began, and I think you're one of the key people that created that field. For someone who was junior at this point in time and thinking about getting into earth science, do you think that the same opportunities exist in geobiology? Do you think there's other fields that exist that maybe don't fully exist yet, in a similar way that might be out there?
Yeah, I'm sure that what people are going to be doing 30 years from now, I couldn't begin to comprehend. On the other hand, a lot changed in earth science beginning more or less in the 1960s. I mean, because geology is different from physics and chemistry in the sense that physics is a way of looking at matter, chemistry is a way of looking at matter. Biology, in a sense, uses chemistry and physics, but again, it's this great diverse set of issues. Geology is the study of an object. It's the Earth, and so in the 1960s, geophysics became prominent, along with the plate tectonic revolution, and again, just revolutionized our study of the physical Earth. At the same time, geochemistry, which existed earlier, really took off, and people started doing things to understand everything from the formation of granites and lavas to metabolism in Earth's past, and that took over. And geobiology, as I said, there were people talking about what we would identify as geobiology a long time ago, and there were some very important thinkers in the early part of the 20th century who did this kind of research. In fact, there was a famous Dutch scientist named Lawrence Bass-Becking, and he coined the term geobiology in the 1930s. On the other hand, it's not like everybody dropped what they were doing and say, now, good, I can be a geobiologist. It wasn't until really in the 1970s and 80s, and believe me, I was not the first person to do geobiological research, but I came along, fortunately for me, at a time when people were starting to appreciate the role of biological processes in shaping the Earth.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. I want to talk about Mars.
Okay.
The story of how you, in the book, of how you got into Mars research is amazing. It just seems kind of so fortuitous. So you talk about this 1990s meeting that you went along to, and then the interactions you had that led to you being on a mission. Do you want to share a few words about that?
Yeah, and it's just it's a particular example of the fact that so much of science is serendipitous. We always think that scientists work like Sherlock Holmes, who just sits down and logically works everything out. But that's not the way it works. we may know nothing about it one day, and then all of a sudden the next day, oh my God, I see what's going on. This happened because there was a famous or infamous, depending on your point of view, paper that came out in the 1990s, in which a group looked at meteorites that were known to come from Mars. That part wasn't at issue. And they claimed evidence for life in these meteorites. Now, that raised a firestorm of debate. But one thing that NASA noticed is that people were interested in the question of, was there life on Mars? And so Al Gore actually put together a meeting of people who worked in areas that were at least relevant to this question. I was invited to it. And this kind of lanky guy comes up to me named Steve Squires. And Steve, and once I got to know him, this all made sense. He made small talk for about 5 femtoseconds. And then he said, how'd you like to be on a Mars mission? I didn't read science fiction when I was a kid. I'd never thought about the issue, but when I thought about it, I thought, yeah, that sounds pretty cool. So yes, I did get to be on the first mission where a rover allowed us to examine the geological history of Mars in the same way that people like me had examined the history of the Earth for a long time. And that was the first of now several successful rover missions. And it was great because, it's the first time in human history where we could actually do a comparative analysis of two planets, because we now start to have similar types of data. So yeah, that changed my life in ways I couldn't have anticipated back then.
Yeah, it must be quite an experience.
Oh yeah.
So going from Mars to even further afield. So I mean, in the book you talk a lot about elements and element cyclings, like the story of carbon, the story of oxygen. And one thing that always strikes me as a physicist is that ultimately the abundances of all the elements we have is coming from the stars. We're all stardust, and it's the fusion within stars that determines those ratios. And so I wonder how much on Earth, like say if the amount of phosphorus we had changed or the amount of oxygen, like do you think life on Earth would still exist in the same way? Do you think it would be completely different?
Well, that's an interesting question. In a sense, the experiment's been run for us because the amount of phosphorus and oxygen have changed dramatically through time. And that which leads me to one of the things that I really stamp my foot on in this book is that many of us, myself included, would love to know whether we're alone in the universe or whether there might be life all over the place. And the more I know about the Earth, the more I start thinking that Earth might not be unusual in having an origin of life. That may happen many places in the universe. But what might make Earth unusual is the fact that life has persisted for 4 billion years. And we know, actually, Robin and I have done some work on Mars together that shows that even when Mars was sort of warm and wet, it was probably warm and wet for 100,000 years and then dry for 20 million and things like that. It's a very different planet. So if life originated on Mars, and it may or may not have, the chances of it persisting through time are very small. You could make the same kind of argument for Venus. So in a sense, we don't know the answer to these, but what I think we're all very lucky in a sense that people have been asking questions about life beyond Earth for thousands of years at the very least. And we're the first generation where that kind of sort of philosophy-oriented approach has given way to exploration. We can go to other places in the solar system. We have things like the James Webb Space Telescope, which can allow us to image planets at much greater distances, beyond our solar system, and at least potentially could find evidence of life, again, because of what life can do to the atmosphere. We're not going to find fossils of life on some planet that's 10 light years away anytime soon. But it is possible that we could find an atmospheric composition that strongly suggests life. I mean, you probably know more about that than I do.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it always strikes me that it's incredible that we now live in this time where technology's got to the point where we can, these questions that we've had for millennia, we can actually go after them and answer them. But I think another aspect about this time, and this is something you get to later in the book, is that, of course, so we have this conversation between life and the earth, and in many ways there's now a third voice in the conversation, which is humanity and all the effects that we're having on the planet. And so I think there's obviously a lot to be really gloomy about in terms of humans' effect on the biosphere, but I was really struck in the book about how hopeful you are as well. And so I'm curious about whether you think there's something about studying the history of life through Earth, the really broad billion-year view that gives you more hope, that gives you perspective on this?
Well, I would say that I think knowing the history of our planet allows us to understand the changes that are happening now as we speak. And one piece of research I did some years ago, there's a very large mass extinction 252 million years ago. And based on the biology of those organisms that either survived the extinction or were extirpated, we decided that it's probably because a whole lot more oxygen rapidly went into the atmosphere. Global warming, the pH of the oceans goes down, something called ocean acidification, oxygen loss at depth in the oceans. And so in a sense, I always liken that to the ghost of Christmas yet to come in the Christmas Carol, because the ghost doesn't tell Scrooge what's going to happen. He tells what's going to happen unless Scrooge does something. And we are fortunate that for many reasons, not all of which, of course, have to do with understanding the deep past, we do know what's happening. And there's a great deal of data. And I think the good news is that there are a lot of very smart, inventive people working on ways in which we can, in some cases, remove CO2 directly from the atmosphere. There are plants that show that that's possible. There are people who are working on different kinds of energy formation that doesn't involve fossil fuels. So there's a lot going on, and I also think that, and many people who work in things like conservation biology came to this conclusion some years ago, that if all you do is talk about doom and gloom, people say, oh, we can't do anything, so why should I worry about it? Whereas I think if you say, look, and I think there is reason for optimism if we invest wisely in what we do, if we make good choices as individuals, good choices as citizens of states, towns, countries, that we can have a world that our grandchildren will inherit that is reasonably like the world we have today. It doesn't have to be that way. We do nothing. The world our grandchildren inherit will not be like the world today. So I think just knowing that it can be done does, and then knowing that humans are known for their ingenuity, gives me some hope.
Yeah, optimism that leads to positive action, not just
Hopefully,
blind optimism that distracts us. I like that way of thinking about it. So I could keep chatting for a long time, but I think it would be great to open things up and get some questions from all of you folks. So
you can.
Yeah, I will. Do you want to start things off?
Thank you. Thank you for this. You mentioned that there are ways of removing CO2 from the atmosphere. Mm-hmm. Can you elaborate?
Okay, there's several. In some, people have figured out how to put, and I am not an expert on this engineering, something on top of smokestacks that actually, I think it's a filtering device. It actively removes CO2 from smoke. And that's been shown to be successful. And now there are plants, I know there's one in Switzerland, there's one in some other places, where rather than just sitting on top of smokestacks, they actually run air through just atmosphere do things. And they are actually fairly successful in removing CO2. And since the addition of CO2, mostly by fossil fuel burning, is what got us into this predicament to begin with, that's one possible way of helping us to get to a better place. There's also, some people have done experiments where you take things like limestone and grind them up and either put them into the sea or into soil, and again, just chemical weathering of that carbonate can actually remove CO2. There's been a little more skepticism about whether that can work on a very large scale basis. There's also a different way of thinking. You might have read about people who would like to put aerosols like sulfate particles into the atmosphere. I'm less excited about that on the one hand, because you would need a fleet of several hundred 747s flying every day to make this work. It's not a straightforward process. And secondly, is while that might cool the Earth by making more incoming solar radiation radiate, back into space, reflected back into space, that we think we know what that results would be like on a global basis, but it might be that it makes Northern Europe much better and makes it impossible to have agriculture in the mid-continent of the United States. We have no idea what will happen there. So we, at the very least, need a lot of experiments. And then finally, one of my biggest problems with that particular way of solving the problem is these aerosols only stay in the atmosphere for a couple of years. So what they don't do is stop CO2 from going into the atmosphere. As long as we're burning fossil fuels, you'll add more CO2 to the atmosphere. And so if we stop then putting aerosols into the atmosphere, within a couple of years, it's like we'd never done anything at all. So that's not my favorite. I do think that, if I were, I don't want to be Elon Musk, but if I was, I would invest in these processes that actually actively remove CO2 from air. Does that answer the question?
You have a question at the back there?
I want to go back to Mars for a second. The Viking lander experiment had, I'll say, ambiguous results. At first they thought there was a signal that life had digested the nutrients. Then later on, it's like, no, perchlorates. We have not tried again. We've landed many rovers, but we've not landed an experiment to directly detect life. And I wish we had. What's your thought about that?
Well, yes, I do side with those who think that that experiment was not strong evidence for life, because it had to do with, as you pointed out, with the oxidation of this nutrient broth that was flown to Mars. And it was an interesting experiment, but when you look at the rate at which CO2 was released from these oxidations, it was not a very biological type of signature. It was more like a signature that says you put a lot of things in and then you slowly deplete the nutrients. So I think I would side with those who say that that evidence, I would probably rate it as something less than ambiguous. I certainly wouldn't be averse to figuring out, I think perhaps, experiments that are more realistic based on what we now know about the surface of Mars. And I know there are people who are thinking about that. It might happen. I think, to be honest, my favorite little snippet of looking for life on Mars was actually a Heineken's beer commercial, where somebody was seeing it, where when the rovers first came out, you saw this thing on the screen that says, "Experiment to detect life on Mars." And then you see somebody open a bottle of Heineken's and put it on the rover, and it says, "And now we wait." So anyway, the serious answer to your question is, I would be in favor of well thought out experiments but they have to be experiments that take advantage of everything that we've actually learned about the surface of Mars in the last 30 years.
Got one on the other side.
Oh, there's one over here? Yeah, go ahead.
Hi, thank you very much. I found this very interesting as just a layperson. Um, your talk about deep time of the Earth's history, and then the cyanobacteria, and how somehow with the evolution of life, plants were able to get the cyanobacteria were added on to plants as the organelle chloroplast. Did I understand that correctly?
Yep, that's correct.
Okay, so then I'm like, oh wow, that really perks my imagination. There is like, okay, so we have in our cells, in our prokaryotic or eukaryotic cells, have the mitochondria.
Yep.
Okay, so mitochondria is an organelle in our human cells that is not a part of us. It's like a bacteria or something. Is that
Right.
related to the cyanobacteria?
That's a different group of bacteria, but yeah,
Oh, and one other
go ahead.
adjunct to that is like, so then is this a clue on how humans may adapt to atmospheric conditions, just the way you had these other leaps before from the algae to the plants, and then humans, is this a clue on how we're going to maybe adapt to atmospheric change?
I think the answer to that is probably not. There have been very few instances of, this is what's called endosymbiosis, where the energy producing entities, if you will, in not only the cells of us, but in all eukaryotic organisms, that, as you say, the mitochondrion, which is where respiration takes place, is now very strong evidence that that originated as a free-living bacterium that was captured and became, like I said, a metabolic slave. And then in some cases also, there was a cyanobacterium that was captured, and that became the organelle for photosynthesis. The mitochondrion, as near as we can tell, only happened once. We now have a second instance of the establishment de novo of a chloroplast from cyanobacteria, but it's a very, very rare event. And I should say that that idea was first floated more than a century ago. And like many other good ideas, nobody ever proved it wrong, but there's this kind of like pocket veto where people just said, no, let's not worry about that. And then in the 1960s, along came a young scientist named Lynn Margulis, who taught at Boston University at the time. And she came up, re-articulated these hypotheses in a world where we now had cell and molecular biology. And by George, she was right. And I've always loved that because, again, it had a very strong effect on my own career choices. Because I was doing a term paper for a botany class, and I actually did my term paper on the origin of the chloroplast. And it was mostly Lynn's papers at the time. And I just thought this was the neatest idea I'd ever heard. And I still do, by the way. And because I was doing this library research on Lynn, I found there was a guy here at Harvard named Elzo Barghorn who was finding evidence of life billions of years before animals. And so then I applied to work with Elzo. Fortunately, was accepted. And my first semester at Harvard, Elzo walked into my office with this fairly young woman, and he says, Andy, I'd like you to meet Lynn Margulis. And to me, that was like Joe DiMaggio or something. It was just the greatest thing. And you know, fortunately, she was then a friend for 40 years. So there's a relationship. Yeah, it's a great story, and we're beholden to Lynn for articulating it in a modern form.
That's a story I haven't heard before. That's a good one. So yeah, we have a couple of questions in the middle.
So since oxygen is an element, it's not synthesized on the Earth, it must have been unbound from compounds that were in the rocks that the cyanobacteria started doing this. What were the main compounds that oxygen was bound in before it became atmospheric?
Yeah, I mean that's a very good question, and to just give some context, is that much of Earth's mass is oxygen, but it's oxygen that's tied up with silicon to make the rock forming minerals, and so that doesn't really react in the ways.
So silicon dioxide it's there, but we say that doesn't really count.
It doesn't count for oxygen in the atmosphere. Turns out that people did experiments in the 1940s that proved that the oxygen that cyanobacteria give off originates from water. So as Robin said, all the oxygen, all the other elements that we have on Earth originated in stars, and then when the Earth formed, we have that. And it's really what are called the volatile elements, things in water, the gases in the atmosphere, and that accumulated, some of it at least, near the surface. And that gave rise to a liquid ocean. Without water, there would be no photosynthesis. So it really, I think the short answer to your question is water is the source of that oxygen.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. I really enjoyed your talk.
Thank you.
As a geologist, what advice would you give to scientists and engineers trying to address climate change?
Well, a number of things. I think we do want to understand better than we do right now what the consequences of global change are from different types of organisms. I was just reading in this week's issue of a magazine called Nature. There's a paper showing that old growth forests actually have higher productivity and exchange elements more readily than younger forests, which that means that just taking places where we have clear-cut forests and growing something else doesn't solve your problems. At least it helps, but it doesn't solve it to make it like it was. So I think we need to understand, biologists can help us to understand a great deal more than we do today about what are the consequences of temperature going up. Again, just in last week's one of the weekly magazines, we're now, global temperatures increasing by about 1/3 of a degree every decade. And that's, if you think about it, you do that for 1 million years and you really change the planet. That just doesn't, that's a big number. And again, knowing what does that mean? What does it mean on a planet where we have changed basically the land cover in more than half the planet for agricultural and animal husbandry? So there's a great deal of scope to learn more about how organisms are responding to global change, to know about which organisms can adapt readily. There are, for example, some corals in the South Pacific that seem not to mind higher temperatures in a way that many do. And people have talked about transplanting some of those so that we'll actually have reefs off of Florida and Australia by the end of the century. And then I think physical scientists too, and there's a great deal of work going on here and at MIT on just, again, understanding the teleconnections between things that we're able to observe and to understand how we might deal responsibly with these things that are happening. So I guess the short answer is there is no shortage of things that people can and I think must do for the basic science. On the other side of the coin, there's no shortage of opportunities for ingenious engineers to change things. And there is then a need both for people who can monitor the discussion between those groups of people who can help the public to be educated about the planet we live on. And this sounds like a pipe dream in 2026 in the United States, but elected officials who take these things seriously.
Well, please join me in a huge thank you to Andrew H. Knoll and Robin Wordsworth.